Webinar Wednesday, Webinar Wednesday, shaping the way we teach English. Webinar course, shaping the way we teach English. Webinar Wednesday.
Welcome to Shaping the Way We Teach English, Webinar Course 15, brought to you by the American English team. My name is Jenny, and I am part of the American English team based here in Washington, D.C. Here you can see the Course 15 schedule, and today we are in our fourth webinar of Course 15. During these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter, and the way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. And this is where you can ask questions and make comments related to today's topic. You will also see myself, moderator Jenny, as well as moderator Heather and moderator Katie in the chat box to help you. But we also rely on the webinar community to help each other. Your presenter may ask you questions in the form of polls, and these will be multiple choice questions that will appear on your screen. We know that some people may experience technical problems, and unfortunately we cannot fix individual technical issues, but we will let you know if we're having a global problem. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod. Webinar courses consist of 6 webinars, and during the course they take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from your regional English language officer or local U.S. embassy. So to ensure you are eligible for the e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance only at the very end of the webinar. Please do not submit your email before we request it, or it will not be counted. So if you are an individual, meaning you're watching this webinar by yourself, then you only need to submit your email address. And if you're watching it with a group of teachers, then please also include the number of participants in your group. We hope that many of you are already familiar with our NING site, but if you haven't visited this website yet, you do need to register to join the site. And here is where you'll find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, and you can also ask the presenter questions after the session. We also post pre-webinar readings, and we'll post the recordings and presentation after the session. So you can go back and watch the webinar or look at the PowerPoint again. Raise your hand if you have downloaded the American English app. We have an app specifically designed for the type of phones you see here on the screen, so basic phones. This app will give you free access to thousands of books, teaching materials, music, and much more. Okay, so today's webinar is entitled Content and Language Integrated Teaching, and this webinar will discuss ways to teach EFL using content from different subject areas. Content and language integrated teaching encourages students to use English language to learn content. So this type of teaching provides English language instruction embedded in or alongside the teaching of a subject area content, resulting in simultaneous learning of content and English. Our presenter today is Heidi Howland, and she was an English language fellow in Malawi and has taught and worked on curriculum development in Japan, trained teachers in Costa Rica, and taught EFL and ESL for over 10 years. She has a BA in English and Psychology, as well as 3 master's degrees in English, in Second Language Education, and International Education Policy. Currently, she works in the Office of English Language Programs at the U.S. Department of State, managing the various digital outreach tools for English language teachers and learners. Welcome, Heidi.
Hi, thank you, Jenny, for that great introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and nice to meet you all. Welcome to Shaping the Way We Teach English webinar, Content and Language Integrated Learning and Teaching. As Jenny told you, I'm Heidi, and I'm really excited to have all of you join me today for this webinar. And it looks like a lot of you from the polls have heard of Content and Language Integrated Learning and Teaching, and most of you integrate subject area content into your English language classes. With a lot of you, it seems, integrating literature and history. I'm also happy to see that many of you integrate other subject area content into your English classes. A lot said that they do so in science and art and geography. So that's great. I just want to quickly go to the polls again, and it's just one yes/no question that I'm going to ask you. So does subject area content have a place in the ESL or EFL classroom? Great. Well, so far almost everyone agrees that it does. Thank you for taking that poll. I'm glad most of you think that it does. I definitely think that it has a place in the EFL classroom. And one reason I really love teaching English language is because I can use subject area content in my lessons to teach English. It's engaging, it's fun, students learn content and language at the same time in a meaningful way. I definitely think subject area content has a place in the EFL classroom. Today, hopefully, I can give you some information on how you too can teach in a way that best integrates subject area content and language learning. So first, let's talk about what the goals of the webinar are. So first, I would like to increase your understanding of content and language integrated learning and teaching. And I hope we can talk about the advantages of content and language integrated learning. And I'm going to give you an overview about how to plan a content and language integrated lesson plan. So let's first define what content and language learning and teaching is. Content and language integrated teaching means that English is used to learn a non-language subject, such as science. Both the subject and the language are learning priorities. So English is used to learn the subject content, and the subject content is used to learn English. And I think it's important that we recognize that both of these are learning priorities. Teachers use content from various subject areas, such as history, science, literature, art, music, geography, to teach English language. And you use English language to teach these various subject areas. So a good question is, why? Why integrate content and language learning? I think that English and subjects are integrated in a mutually beneficial way. So by integrating them, it adds greater meaning and value to the students' learning of both. We're going to talk about some of the advantages of content and language integrated learning. But first, let's go to the polls again. So I want to ask you, which of the following are advantages to content and language integrated learning for students? And you can check as many as you think are relevant. Great, so I'm seeing a lot of you think that English learning is more meaningful by doing this. And also, so many of you think that content provides more opportunities to integrate culture. And some of you think that students gain knowledge of a topic in depth, and that students learn to read different types of text, and that students may be more motivated learners. Great. So most of you think that English learning is more meaningful. Thank you for taking that poll. We're going to talk about some of the advantages for students now, a little more in depth. One of the advantages for students is that they're learning English within a context. The students learning within a context is called contextualization. Contextualization makes the content and learning more meaningful and practical. Connections are made across subject areas. Students are able to practice all 4 skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, within this purposeful context. The content provides a wider cultural context. So when students are learning about subject matter, they're also learning about culture. And for me, I think real life is not separated by subject areas, right? So therefore, learning across different subject areas is more meaningful and is more relevant to real life. Also, this increases opportunities for students. So to be able to use English in subject areas and contextualizing making the content and learning more meaningful and practical, it can increase the students' further educational or career opportunities as well. So let's talk about a few more advantages for students. The next advantage is that students get to practice different skills. So by using content in your English language classroom, students learn to read and analyze different types of texts. So for example, if I am teaching using maybe history content, then perhaps my students are reading biographies, letters, maybe even short stories, newspaper articles. If I'm teaching science, for example, or using science, for example, then perhaps they're reading lab reports. So they're able to gain greater skills in that way. Students also use all 4 skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, with this different type of content. And because they're thinking of content in different ways and analyzing different types of text, they're using different types of thinking as well. And students can, depending on how much you integrate the content into your lesson, they can gain knowledge of a topic much more in depth. Students also are able to understand the topic from multiple perspectives. And depending on the activities that you use in your class, then students are learning skills like collaboration, group work, and problem solving. So other skills that aren't necessarily related to learning the content or English. So lots of advantages for students. Another advantage is that it increases student motivation. So there's now a purpose for the language learning. Students are learning something meaningful while using the language. And maybe especially for students who don't see the purpose of grammar or don't like learning grammar. I'm sure we have some of those students. Now they can learn it in a more meaningful way because they're using form, the grammar, as a way to understand content. So the grammar now has a meaning for them. So next we're going to talk about some advantages for teachers, but I want to go to the polls again first. And my question for you is, which of the following advantages of using content and language integrated teaching are for you as teachers? And again, you can choose more than one answer. So already it looks like a lot of you see the first one, that you're able to teach about a topic that is meaningful and interesting, as a definite advantage. And a lot of you think that one advantage is that you're able to be creative. Great. Yeah, and you have more flexibility in how you teach. I see a lot of you checking that off as well. And you have the opportunity to adapt materials to your students' needs. Absolutely. And some of you think that you have an opportunity to collaborate with other teachers. Fantastic. Thank you for that poll. We are going to talk about these advantages now for teachers. From that poll that you took, I think that using this type of teaching allows you to do all of those things, that those are all advantages for you as a teacher. You can be creative, you can have flexibility, you can collaborate with other teachers, and you can adapt materials for your students' needs. So let's talk about these a little bit more. So first, creativity. Teachers are able to be more creative with this type of teaching. You can use multiple types of texts with a purpose. You can do different types of activities to use in your classroom. You can be creative about how you adapt your materials to suit your students' needs. And flexibility. So this isn't an all or nothing method. You can teach using this method for a very short period of time, maybe for one theme or even for 1 or 2 lessons. So it's a very flexible method of teaching that you can use in your classroom for as much as you want or as little as you want. So I think that makes it pretty flexible. Also, as teachers, or at least for myself when I was a teacher, oftentimes I was isolated and planning lessons by myself and teaching by myself. And this method of teaching kind of enables us to cooperate with other teachers so that we can learn from content area teachers if we don't have the background knowledge that we need. We can coordinate our lessons together and maybe even help each other plan. So I think it's very helpful to use this method since you're trying to or you are teaching content. You can talk to content area teachers, and in that way you can cooperate together, and that will help your teaching. You're also using this method, you're able to connect multiple subject areas. You're able to teach a topic in depth. You can choose themes that are meaningful and interesting to your students, and I think we all know that's very important. So now let's talk about maybe some of the challenges of this. So one of the challenges is that we may, as teachers, lack the subject area knowledge that we need. But my question is for you, how can this also be an opportunity? And I'd like you to answer that question in the chat box. So how can the lack of content knowledge become an opportunity for you as teachers? So if you just want to take a couple minutes to type in an answer. Great. Luis from Mexico, you can learn more. Excellent. Research, yes, so that's an opportunity to research. Thank you from Ecuador. It's an opportunity to grow. Yeah, Pedro from Mexico, absolutely. Gilbert from Senegal, yep, cooperation with teachers, great. It gives us that opportunity. Oh, and I love that, I think from Costa Rica, it was going up off the chat box, but it allows us to have autonomy in the classroom. I think that is a great answer. So we get to learn about the subject as we plan to teach it. And Sandra says it's an opportunity for collaboration. From Nicaragua, you can go deeper into the content area. Yeah, great. And Yasmin, you get to gain knowledge. Absolutely. These are all great answers. It's in some ways professional development. Sandra from Columbia, I saw that you wrote that. Anytime we get to learn more, at least for me, I love to do that. So I really think this is an opportunity for us to learn about these subject areas and gain knowledge and collaborate with other teachers. If you don't have the content knowledge, then you do need to be comfortable enough to research the content areas and understand content from these various subject areas. And I saw a question from Columbia, and I think that's a great question to ask at the end of the webinar about using this method with all ages. So we'll have some time at the end of the webinar to answer questions. So if you want to ask me that at the end, that would be great. And Natalie says we can share experiences. Absolutely. So as teachers, sharing our knowledge and experiences is definitely an opportunity. Okay, so let's go on to maybe what we think is another challenge and see how that could become an opportunity. So another challenge is a lack of materials. This could be a big challenge. But how could this become an opportunity? If you could answer that question in the chat box, that would be great. So how could the lack of materials become an opportunity? It makes us more creative. Great. From Turkey. You need to be creative. Columbia, Fanny from Columbia. Yeah, we learn to be resourceful. Great. Another Pamela. Thank you. Yeah, I'm seeing so many great answers. You can discover skills you didn't know you had. Absolutely. Create your own material. Thank you from Paraguay. Adapt your material. Great, from Bolivia. Create your own material from Oman. Yes. We can use our imagination from Mexico. Absolutely. Need is the mother of creativity. Thank you, Mohammed from Egypt. Yes. Alicia from Monterrey, Mexico. You may adapt better to your students' needs. Yeah, excellent. When we have to adapt or create our own materials, we definitely can do so to meet our students' needs in a better way. We know our students best. Recycle ideas. Yeah, Gilbert, use colleagues' materials. Absolutely, sharing materials. Asking your colleagues. I see someone else. Kamala, I see that. Yes, excellent. And we recycle materials for other classes. Absolutely. So you see how we get to be really creative in using this method of teaching. Exchange materials, absolutely great. These are great ideas. Thank you so much. So I think all of these that we've talked about are great ideas for how this could become an opportunity. So let's go on to planning a lesson or unit. Content and language integrated learning, there are 4 C's to it that Coylhood and Marsh thought of. And the 4 C's are content, communication, cognition, and culture. And content is, of course, subject area. Communication, the language learning. And it's important to keep in mind that the language, these first 2, the language and the content, they need to match and level. So language can be challenging, but it shouldn't be overwhelming. In other words, don't use a graduate level journal article to teach 12-year-olds about environmental issues. Maybe that content is appropriate for that age group, but that language of the article will not be. So you have to take care, of course, of that. Cognition is the learning and thinking process, and culture. So by using content, we bring culture into our classroom even more. So we're going to talk about how to put the 4 C's in context. So first, I'll give an overall view of the way you can use the 4 C's to plan a lesson or unit. And then I'll go into detail and I'll give an example of planning a content and language integrated learning lesson. So first a general overview, and then a much more specific, like starting to plan a lesson. So starting with the general overview, the first thing you want to do, obviously, is to choose the subject areas you want to integrate into your English classroom. So remember the question you answered before the webinar began. I asked you what subject area content you integrate into your English class, and so many of you responded. So now I want you to think about which of those subject areas are you comfortable with teaching and integrating into your classrooms. So that's one really important question we need to ask ourselves as teachers when we think of which subject areas we will integrate. Am I comfortable with this subject? If not, then am I comfortable researching and learning about it before teaching it? If you don't know a lot about the subject area you want to teach, that's perfectly okay, as long as you're comfortable researching and learning about it beforehand. So other questions we want to ask ourselves as teachers when we decide a subject area. What subject information do my students need to learn? What subject area content will help my students learn the language they need to learn? So those are some questions we want to ask when we're choosing subject area. The next thing we want to do is choose a theme or topic. Things to consider when we do this. Is the theme or topic relevant to your students' age and interests? Is it meaningful? Is it interesting to teach? Does it provide a context for meaningful use of the language? Can it be connected to more than one subject area? Is it useful for teaching subject area content and English? So that's a very important one, because of course this whole process is about teaching content and English. And again, with the topic, are you comfortable teaching about it, or do you feel comfortable learning what you need to know in order to teach it? The next thing you want to do is consider the teaching objectives. So what knowledge and skills you, as the teacher, want to teach. And of course, the learning outcomes. What you want your students to be able to know at the end of the lesson. The next thing you want to do is define the language you will be teaching. Vocabulary, grammar, and language functions. So you want to choose vocabulary that is necessary for your students to understand the content that you will be teaching. Same thing with grammar. And the language functions for learning the content and for activities. So for example, if I am using cooking as a theme, then I might choose grammar and language functions such as giving instructions and following instructions. And the next thing we want to do is choose activities that support learning content and English. So we want to think about activities that are communicative, that maybe are problem-solving activities, that are activities that give students a real-life context, that hopefully have all 4 skills being used by the students: reading, writing, speaking, listening. And to keep in mind that you want your activities to build upon each other so that the language is being recycled, because we all know that this makes students learn the information. And the next thing you want to consider when you're planning a lesson is your resources. So finding resources, making resources, adapting resources. Is there, for example, reading material appropriate for your students' English level regarding this subject area content, regarding your topic? If not, then can you easily adapt material for your students' level or needs? Can students help you make materials as part of their learning? So, for example, maybe students can make vocabulary cards as part of an activity. So students can also help with resources as long as they are learning in the process. Right? Raise your hand if sometimes you have difficulty finding resources for your classes. Yeah, I see a lot of hands going up immediately. Yes. So if you have difficulty finding resources for your classes, raise your hand. Yeah, absolutely. I think as teachers, we have all been there. I see someone writing that they have no difficulty at all. That's awesome. I wish I were in the same boat all the time. So we're going to talk about resources later in the webinar and where to find them. But first, I want to go into more detail about planning a lesson or unit. And I want to show you a template. So this is a great template that is easy to make and use for lesson planning when you're using content and language integrated learning and teaching in your classroom. I want you to notice that for both teaching objectives and learning outcomes, we want to consider both content and cognition. So when planning a lesson, we want to think about the content that we will teach and the content that the students will learn. But we also want to think about the thinking process, the cognition. So what higher order thinking skills do we want our students to master through this lesson? And that's the cognition part of both of those. And by higher order thinking skills, I mean things like critical thinking, problem solving, analyzing, evaluating. So we want to think about those as well as just content. We also, of course, want to consider the language learning. Right? It's helpful to look at the language learning in two ways. Language of learning and language for learning. So language of learning is what language is necessary for students when they are learning the content. And by language for learning, I mean what language is necessary for them to understand how you are teaching. And I will go into more detail about this later in the webinar. But first, I want to go to the polls again and ask you the question, if we are teaching a lesson about weather, what are some key vocabulary and key phrases to teach? What might we want to teach our students if I'm doing a lesson on weather? And you can check as many as you think apply. Great, I'm seeing sunny. Yeah, I really wish it were sunny here in Washington, D.C. today. Breezy, great. It's blank today. Yeah, excellent, excellent phrase. Hot, yep. I see some of you putting ice cream. I tell you, when it's hot, I definitely want to eat ice cream. I'm not sure if that's the best vocabulary we want to use when we're teaching weather, but totally understand the connection there. Tornado, Again, swimming pool, see the connection, because when it's hot, you want to go in the pool. I do, but maybe not the best vocabulary to be teaching for that lesson. Hurricane, great. What's the weather like? Excellent. Forecast, yes. A blank % chance of? Great. There's a 50% chance of snow tomorrow. Actually, I think it's like 90% chance of snow tomorrow here in DC, unfortunately. Rainy and floods. Excellent. Yes, thank you for doing that poll. So let's see what I came up with for some language of learning for a lesson on weather. So great. What's the weather like? It's sunny today. It will be cold tomorrow. And then all sorts of weather vocabulary that you guys chose on that poll. Sunny, foggy, clouds, wind, And then weather forecast, chart, data, weather report, a chance of, excellent. So this is the language of learning. This is the language that the students need to understand the content. And then we have the language for learning. So this is the language the students will need to understand the lesson and to understand your instructions. So this is a language that most likely they're hearing from you give to them. So it's different from the specific content-related language. For example, if I'm teaching a lesson on weather, I would not choose language of learning, what do you see in this picture? However, if I am teaching a lesson on weather and I am showing my students pictures of different types of weather, I probably will ask them using this language, what do you see in this picture? So the language for learning is the it's the language that the students will hear from you. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is to get more in detail about how to create a lesson. So I'm going to walk you step by step based on that overview. So the first thing I want to do, as we discussed, is to choose a subject area that I want to integrate into my teaching. And remember, this can be dependent on many factors. My students, my background, my school. For me, I am going to choose science. Raise your hand if you like science. Great, I see some people immediately raise, ooh, a lot of people, yes, I'm with you in liking science. Thank you. Awesome. Don't worry if you don't like science, it's okay, hopefully. You might like it more by the end of this. So the next thing we want to do is choose a topic, right, or a theme. And remember, we want to choose something that can engage our students, can foster good real life and contextual language practice, and that's relevant to them. So let's go to the polls one more time. And my question now for you is what topic could we choose for our subject area science? And again, you can check as many as you think apply. Great, so a lot of you are already saying the solar system, absolutely. The human body, great. The life cycle of a plant, yes. The water cycle, absolutely. And the environment, yes. Fantastic. So within one subject area, we have so many topics and themes that we can choose from. Great, thank you for that, for taking that poll. You guys are right on. So like I said, we have a lot of topics that we can choose from just within science. I am going to choose the topic Endangered Animals because I know that my students love animals. So I think that I can really engage them with this topic. I also think that there's relevancy in real life for them and that I can create activities that foster great language practice using this topic. So right now, I'm going to play a short clip from a song. The song is entitled Endangered Song. What I want you to listen for is the sentence, "You don't have to worry." And I just want you to think about and keep track in your head of how many times you hear this sentence in this short song clip. So the sentence again is, "You don't have to worry." Great. Thank you for that. And thank you, Katie, for putting the website of this song up there if you want to hear the whole thing. And so many of you are putting 4 times. Yes, excellent. And I noticed that someone had written in the chat box about being a context for their students, that it's a local context for them in Costa Rica, this topic. So great. Local context is definitely a way to get students interested. So I'm going to have 2 questions for you. The first one is, the song is called Endangered Song. What does it mean when something is endangered? So what does that word mean, endangered? You can write your answer in the chat box. Great, Patricia from Bolivia, about to disappear, good. Something to be saved, I like that explanation from the Philippines. Something is threatened, great. At risk of becoming extinct, fantastic, Mehmet. It is in danger, yes. About to disappear, from Mexico, absolutely. Under a risk, from Mario, yeah. Something is decreasing, Gabriela, absolutely. Great, great answers. Problems, I agree with that answer, Aman. Ulissa, almost lost, fantastic. I love these definitions of this one word. Roberto, about to disappear, yes. So, in the song, you listened for the sentence, you don't have to worry. Raise your hand if you think we do have to worry about endangered animals. We do have to worry about endangered animals. Raise your hand. Great. I see a lot of you immediately raising your hand for that. I think so too. And because I think we have to worry, I think this topic can really engage students. I also think it can provide them with activities where they can communicate and problem solve, because I think this is something that perhaps we can find solutions for. So let's start to go in depth of planning this lesson, and we'll look at what my teaching objectives are for this lesson. So remember that my teaching objectives will be both about content and cognition. And let's go through these one at a time. So remember that my teaching objectives are what I will teach. So the content is what content I will teach related to endangered animals. So what I will teach in terms of content, I'm going to explain what an endangered animal is. I'm going to talk about different factors that can cause or help cause an animal to become endangered. And I'm going to explain the cause and effect relationship between human activity and endangered animals. Now, in the cognition section, I want to include what higher order thinking skills I will teach as I teach the content related to endangered animals. So remember those higher order thinking skills like analyzing, evaluating, critical thinking, problem solving. So I want to have students evaluate the importance of ecosystems. I want to have students map out places where the top 10 or some of the top 10 endangered animals live and how many of each exists. I want them to problem solve threats to endangered animals. And I want to prepare and guide students through the cause and effect relationships using scientific evidence. Now let's move on to the learning outcomes. So remember that we also want to think about student outcomes. So this is what we want students to be able to do by the end of the lesson in relation to content and cognition. So again, let's look at each of these specifically. So by the end of the lesson, I want my students, they will be able to identify endangered animals, explain factors that can cause an animal to become endangered, make cause and effect connections between human activity and endangered animals. And for cognition, these higher order thinking skills, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to research and record data of endangered animals on a map, analyze ecosystems and the interconnectedness of life on Earth, analyze scientific data to understand cause and effect relationships, and learn to reason using scientific evidence. So we have reasoning skills, analyzing skills, researching skills. So these are the skills, the higher order thinking skills under this cognition part of our lesson plan. So now let's think about the language that we will be teaching in this lesson. Remember that there are two things we want to think about: language of learning and language for learning. Language of learning is the language necessary for students when learning the content. We can think of it as vocabulary, grammar, and key phrases. Let's look at the vocabulary needed for teaching about endangered animals. So let's go to the polls again. Let's see what you have to say about key vocabulary you can think of for this topic. What would be some vocabulary that you would teach for a lesson on endangered animals? And again, you can check as many as you think are relevant. Great. Wildlife, excellent. Conservation, jungle, endangered, yes. Water, habitat, pollution, ecosystem, great. Extinction, yes. Excellent. Yeah, well done. Those are great vocabulary that we can use for our lesson. Thank you for that poll. So let's see what I had for my vocabulary. Endangered, extinction, ecosystem, habitat, conservation, climate change, poaching, food chain. Fantastic. Some of these are the ones that you had chosen as well. So now let's think about what grammar or key phrases I could teach for this topic. One I can think of if I'm teaching a class that's a little bit higher level English level is conditionals. For example, if we don't stop poaching, which means illegally killing, endangered animals, then they will become extinct. So they will no longer exist. So a conditional, I think that fits really well with this lesson. So that might be a grammar, some grammar that I want to teach. What other grammar or key phrases can you think of that would be appropriate to use in this lesson for teaching this topic? You can write your responses in the chat box. If clause is very relevant, yes. There are, excellent, that's great. I'm from Pilar, from Spain, yeah. I think depending on your level, your student's level of English, that would be a great one for beginners. Hassan, passive, yes, great. Future if conditional, I'm seeing from, I'm sorry, I lost your name, it's going so quickly. Elvira, modal verbs, yes, excellent. And future forms, possibilities, yes, Yasmin from Mexico. Ali, used to, yes, great. I see a very specific passive voice with get from Jonathan from Costa Rica, yes, excellent. Liana, future perfect, yes. And a lot of you are reiterating conditionals, yes. Pilar, comparatives, excellent. Adjectives to describe habitats. Yes, Benita from Bolivia. That's a great suggestion. Why don't we Catalina from Cyprus. Yes, a key phrase we might want to use. Great. From Mara, asking questions. Yes, of course. Fantastic. These are really great responses, everyone. So let's see what I came up with. I actually think you guys came up with better ones than I have down here. So thank you for all your input. So some of the grammar and key phrases that I had were conditionals, giving advice. So giving advice about what we need to do in order to prevent endangered species from becoming extinct. What will happen if? How can we prevent? If we don't, then they are endangered because. So those are some key phrases, and then my grammar, conditionals, and giving advice. So thank you so much for all of your input on that. Great. So now that we have some of our language of learning, let's look at our language for learning. So remember that language for learning is the language necessary for students to understand as you're teaching. So it's the language that you're using to instruct them. It's not necessarily the content language, although it can overlap. So some of the language for learning that I might be using for this lesson is, what are some solutions to this problem? How are these two things related? So at the beginning of my lesson planning, I wanted to teach students about the cause and effect relationship between human activity and endangered species. So this might be a question that I would be asking maybe a lot in my class. How are these two things related? How is climate change related to the decreasing population of tigers, for example? I have no idea the answer to that question, but I'm going to look that up as soon as I'm done here, because now I'm interested in that. All right, so let's move on to our activities. So when planning for activities, if you remember, we definitely want activities to be communicative, right? We want to recycle that key language so our students really learn it. We want it to have a real life context. And we want our students to practice, we want to try to get our students to practice all 4 skills in our activities. So reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And if possible, hopefully our activity can help students problem solve. So one activity we can use is an information gap. Raise your hand if you have used information gap activities in your classroom before. Great, I see a lot of hands being raised. Excellent. Yes, great. So a lot of you have used information gap activities. If you haven't, that's fine. We're going to walk through my example of an information gap activity. So in an information gap or info gap, the students are in pairs and they each have different information. And they must communicate with each other and work collaboratively in order to get the entire picture, in order to get all the information. So let's look at my example so it's clearer. So you are seeing student 1's card and student 2's card, but usually you only have one card. So student 1 has half of the information and student 2 has the other half. So in order to get all of the information, they need to communicate with each other in order to get that information. So for example, student 1 has to ask student 2 what area is the Amur leopard found. And if you notice in this example, the students are using English with key vocabulary they have learned about endangered species. And they're doing this to learn more about the subject area content. So they're using English, learning more about the content, so where the endangered species live, what threatens them, how many are still remaining. So this is a way to blend content and language in one activity. And after they complete and get all the information in pairs, they can also map, like put on a map, the information. So students can see where these endangered animals are located. And it gives them a great geographical context. They can map the name of the animal, the threats, and how many are still in existence. And if you have a very large class, you can have pairs that have totally different endangered animals than the ones of the pairs that you saw in the previous slide, so that you're mapping on a huge map, if you have it, 20 different endangered animals, for example. So let's see if this activity does what we want it to do. So once more, we want our activities to be communicative, to have a real-life context, to allow students to practice reading, writing, speaking, listening, and hopefully encourage problem solving. So let's see if this activity, I want to know what you think. Let's see if this activity did those things. So let's go to the polls again. So which of the following are true? And you can check as many as you think apply. And this is for the info gap activity that you just saw. Right, so immediately, so many of you are saying it enables students to communicate. Yeah, absolutely. Right? Good. It has a real-life context. Great. And I'm seeing a lot of you also now checking off, it allows students to practice reading, writing, speaking, listening. Yeah, absolutely. And encourages problem solving. Good. All right. Well, thank you for taking that quick poll. I do think that this activity for sure enables students to communicate, right? I also think it allows them to practice all 4 skills. So they're reading, they're writing, they're speaking, they're listening. I think it has a real-life context, especially with the added mapping at the end. So they're really visualizing where these animals are in relation to themselves and their country. I think it can encourage problem solving, right? They're solving the problem of lack of information, so I think that's great. If you have any, so many of you said that you use information gaps. So if you have a resource for an information gap, you can write it in the chat box to share with others if you want to do that now, since so many of you said that you use them. So that would be great. Or you can share it on the Ning after this. We're going to move on to another activity. We are going to move on to the jigsaw. So raise your hand if you have heard of the jigsaw technique or jigsaw activity. Oh, fantastic. So many of you have. That's great. Yeah. Okay, again, if you haven't heard of this, do not worry. We're going to walk through an activity so that you can see what it's like. The jigsaw technique is a method of organizing classroom activity that makes students dependent on each other to succeed. So it breaks classes into groups and breaks assignments into pieces that the group then assembles to complete, like a jigsaw puzzle. And hopefully when we go through the example, this will become clear. So we're going to take a look at how we can use this type of activity with our topic, endangered animals. So, for example, I have 5 endangered animals that I want to have my students learn about. So I put my students into 5 groups. Each group is given an endangered animal. They are given information to read about that animal's threats to its existence. Together, they discuss the information and discuss solutions to these issues that threaten the animal. And I'm going to, so it's very collaborative, right? They're working together. And I'm going to give you an example of a website with information about one of the endangered animals. Please don't worry, you don't need to read all of the words on the screen. I know it might be hard for some of you to see. Also an important point, this text might be difficult for some students, like more difficult for some than others. This might be a text that you need to adapt. And this text is from worldwildlife.org, and Katie has put the link in your chat box, which is great. And they have readings on all different endangered animals there. So because it might be more difficult for some students than others, the great thing about the Jigsaw activities is that students are working collaboratively to read, understand, and discuss the information that you give them. Therefore, they work through it together. So it gives the opportunity for students to contribute on parts that they understand better, and then listen to other students about parts that maybe they don't understand as well. But again, the reading shouldn't be so challenging that some students don't understand any of it, right? So you still need to consider your student's age and level of English when choosing or adapting texts. But one thing I really love about the Jigsaw is it gives the opportunity for everyone to kind of come together and discuss a text and give their input on the parts that they understand well. While students are reading and discussing, they can have a graphic organizer like this one, where they can write down and organize their ideas. So you want to let your students know that, that they're going to be sharing this information with other people in the class. So really, they are becoming an expert on this topic. And I think that's really great for student motivation, right? They are going to become, in a sense, the teacher and teach other students who don't have that information. So it's important that they take good notes individually as the group discusses. It's very collaborative, it's very communicative. Okay, so after they do this, one member from each group meets in a new group. Each person talks about their animal. So again, they're the expert on that one animal. So they're teaching the other 4 people in their group. They talk about that animal, the threats to its existence, and the solutions that their group had come up with collectively. Then the listeners can add any solutions that they can think of. And then together, so each person does that individually. So you have 5 people all teaching about one animal to each other. And then together, the group can report back out to the whole class in some way. It can be just speaking, it can be visually, like in a poster, it can be in writing or in a chart. So let's see if this activity does what we want it to do. If it enables students to communicate, if it has a real-life context, if it encourages problem solving, and if it allows students to use all 4 skills. So let's go to the polls again. And which of the following are true? So for the Jigsaw, and you can click as many as you want to about this activity. So is this activity a good activity for what we want it to do? And I see, yeah, great. So I see so many of you have checked all of these off. Almost everyone thinks it enables students to communicate, absolutely. Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you for taking that quick poll. I absolutely agree with you. I think it does all of those things and more. Students were communicating, there was a real-life context, they're problem-solving, they use all 4 skills, they're also collaborating. So yeah, excellent, thank you. And now I want to talk about resources for our lesson. So I'm going to talk about resources because of the challenges that teachers have that we identified at the beginning of the PowerPoint. So if you remember, these 2 challenges are lack of content knowledge and lack of materials. So the American English at State website has a lot of free resources available that are designed specifically for English language teachers. Plus, we have links to other websites that have free educational materials that you can use and maybe adapt for your classroom. So I hope that by walking you through this, I can show you ways that we can address both of those challenges, both lack of content knowledge and lack of materials. So giving you a platform where you can find materials and in the process gain more content knowledge. So raise your hand if you have used the American English website before. I'm seeing hands going up. Excellent. So the American English website's address is americanenglish.state.gov. So some of you have. Excellent. Okay, well, hopefully that after this, you'll see how useful it can be to find subject area content information and teaching materials. So first of all, we have our own content, which are free, totally free on the website and free to download. So if you're teaching, for example, U.S. history and culture, we have the resource called Celebrate. You can see the picture of the cover in the top left corner of that slide. So this text gives detailed information about U.S. holidays, and importantly, it's designed for English language learners and teachers. We also have a resource for art called Create to Communicate. So this text, if you want to integrate, if the content area you want to, if the subject area content you want to integrate into your English classroom is art, this might be a great text to use. We also have a lot of other resources that you can find on our website. So some of these resources are content related. And I'm going to walk you through how to search for these resources, and hopefully this will be really helpful for you to be able to quickly find resources for the subject area you want to integrate into your classroom. So on our homepage, we have a resources tab. If you click on that, you come to this page of our website, and you want to click on Resources for Teachers. Once you do that, you will see this page, and there's a search box that is circled here. And you can type into the search box. Since I chose science, I am going to type in science because that is my subject area. By doing so and searching for science, there are 47 results. One of these results is the Smithsonian Student Science and Nature page. So I can click on where it says online, and I've circled their website. I can click on that website, and it will take me directly to their website. So for many websites that we linked to the American English website, there are free teaching materials available. For example, on this Smithsonian Science Center website, there's a tab, as you can see circled in red, to go to teaching materials. And here I can find a lot more information that I can use to teach subject area content. Or if I just lack background knowledge, maybe I just need information for myself, and this is a place I can go. So here's one related reading that I found on the Smithsonian website. So for my topic, Endangered Animals, the disappearing habitats is one of the problems of animals for becoming endangered. So I think this would be a great reading for students to use in my class about this topic, what's happening with habitats. And again, I found this from the American English website, linking out to the Smithsonian Science Center website. So, excuse me, this might not be completely appropriate for my students in terms of their reading level or vocabulary level. So if necessary, I can adapt this reading to the needs of my students. You can learn more about how to adapt materials to meet your classroom needs in the last Shaping the Way We Teach English webinar, which was called Adapting Materials to Meet Your Classroom Needs. This is on the American English YouTube channel. And that is all I have time for today. I want to thank you so much for attending this webinar. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned something about content and language integrated learning and teaching. Thank you all so much for your participation today. I really appreciated all your great comments. If you have any questions for me, we have a few minutes for question and answer time. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and I will respond to as many as I can in the time remaining. And also feel free to continue this conversation on the Ning. Well, I'm not seeing any questions, but thank you all so much again. I see one question actually, can you download PDF documents on American English? So yes, a lot of our materials on the American English website are in PDF form that you can download. And I'm seeing an invitation to come to Costa Rica. Thank you so much. I will take you up on that. I actually used to live there, and I miss it so much every winter. So from Colombia, I have one question. Can I use this method with all ages? Great question. I think absolutely. So because this is such a flexible and adaptable method of teaching, I think as long as you are, when you start planning your lesson, you recognize your students' level of English, and then, of course, knowing that the content is appropriate for that age. But when we started the brief overview of lesson planning, I kind of really quickly talked about weather as a topic, and I think, for example, that would be appropriate for young learners, for example. And definitely you can use this up to adults, of course. So I think as long as you're conscientious and conscious of the topic and the language that you're teaching, then you can use it for all ages. Let's see. How about asking students from Iraq, how about asking students to choose topics for discussion? Is that possible? I think that's a really great question. I know some teachers are bound by their own school's curriculum, but if you have the possibility to give your students that autonomy to choose a topic, I wouldn't recommend it for choosing it every time you do this, but I definitely think that students own their own learning when they are deciding what you are going to be teaching. So if you do have the opportunity to do that, and the topic that they choose fits in a way that is useful for their language and content learning, absolutely. I think that's a fabulous question. Yes, and Pamela from Colombia, could you please clarify the difference between language of learning and language for learning? Absolutely, and I know this is a little bit tricky, often because it overlaps. So really simply and in general, you can think of the language of learning as the language that the students need to know in order to read about the content, talk about the content, do the activities related to the content that they're learning. And the language for learning would be the language that I, as the teacher, am using in the classroom to give instructions, to help students learn the content. So it's the language that the students need to know in order to understand my, let's say, instructions, to keep it simple. I hope that helps clarify. And I'm seeing a couple other questions. I just want to make sure I have time for maybe one more question. I'm going to ask the moderators. Yes, okay. So let's see, would you use this method for projects? I'm not exactly 100% clear what you mean by projects, but I will answer as best as I can, and hopefully I'm understanding this correctly. So in terms of doing projects in the classroom, absolutely. I think as long as your students are learning the content and the language at the same time, then whether they're doing an activity or a longer project, it doesn't matter, it's the same. So as long as they are learning both at the same time, and that's great, and using it in a useful, with real life context way. Super good question. Asim Pakis, what should be focused on during assessment, content or language? That is a fantastic question, and that absolutely depends. So as English language teachers, as all of you are, then I would assume we all definitely want to assess the language. Depending on what else you want your students to gain from your class, we should be assessing the content as well, whether or not they have the same weight in the assessment, that is really up to you or up to your school. I definitely, because they're so intertwined in the learning, I think it's impossible to assess, or not impossible, but I think it's, it does a disservice to the students to just assess one. So I really think it's important to assess both, but how much weight each has, I think, is dependent on you as a teacher or on your school. And let me see if we have time for one more question. If not, then we can continue this conversation on the Ning. All right, so I think we are going to wrap up now. Thank you so much for all of your great questions, and you can continue this or ask me questions. I will have a question on the Ning for you as a follow-up, so I look forward to seeing your responses there. Thank you guys so much.